James 3:13. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. Pardon me for suggesting you underline what it is that is to come from wisdom. Humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, of the devil. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes down from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. In this remarkable letter, we have the New Testament equivalent of the passage on wisdom that I read to you from Solomon's writings yesterday morning. As we think about educational planning and the development of institutional forms of education, we must be careful to consider the various sorts of costs. And there are at least three costs that are worth thinking about. The first of these is the cost of bringing something into being. These are financial costs and human costs. The costs of bringing something into being. Second is the cost of the outcome. And the cost of the outcome is always a very real matter. You must always ask, is it worth it? Is this an effective stewardship of resources? Is it worth it? And the third cost is the cost of drift. The cost of drift. And it is this one that I wish to speak to you about today. There are, in every human endeavor, drifts. A drift is when, as you know at sea, a prevailing wind or a tide can move you off the course that you believe you are on. A ship may be going steadfastly and stalwartly due west, as far as its compass is concerned and as far as the visual orientation from the deck is concerned. We are going due west, or east, or north, or whatever. But because of the drift of the current of the sea, or the movement of the wind, we are in fact drifting in a direction that is somewhat different than we intend. This is what navigation is all about. This is why a person who is able to handle a ship well takes into account much more than the direction of the prow. Takes into account much more than just the apparent, obvious factors, and understands something of the pressures of the tides and the movements of the sea and the effects of prevailing winds. This little allegory is not unlike that which is confronting you in the University of the Nations. You are entering into, by virtue even of changing the name, and I refer not to changing the name of PACU to University of the Nations, because PACU already has staked itself as a university, but the changing of the emphasis within YWAM to be expressed as the University of the Nations and all that that suggests. You are entering a sea where there are different tides. And there are different forces of drift upon your craft. And your apparent direction may not be your real direction. There is a cost of drift. And it requires a correction in the steering, in fact, to overcorrect for that drift effect. Enough for the allegory. Let us get into the concrete of it. First of all, theologically, it is a fallen world. Although a number of educational institutions that are Christian from top to bottom would perhaps want to deny this, it is not feasible for us to understand educational institutions as being totally redeemed and on their way to glory. Now, I can think of 2 or 3 Christian colleges and at least 2 or 3 theological seminaries that are pretty sure that they are themselves already at the very front porch of heaven. But I submit to you that if I read the Bible correctly, there's not a ding-dong one of them going to heaven. When we get to glory, we're going to leave back our alumni cards. I make a bit of humor of this for good reason. It's important for us really to honestly face what we have and what we don't have in terms of a human institution. A human institution is like an extension of persons. It is a group of people in some kind of condition before God, simply extending themselves corporately into being more of what they are. It does not change their being. We are not changed by simply becoming part of a school. We are still people. As a matter of fact, the school is not much more than an extension of who we are. But strangely and sometimes mysteriously, institutions take on a kind of quality of life of their own. Let me give you a brief scenario of how that works. Most of us value compassion. And although we recognize the importance of a rule, we are delighted to see in the handling of justice that there can also be mercy with reference to that rule. And in most Christian institutions, we value the idea of people being compassionate, even as God himself is compassionate, to provide in his mercy an answer for the demands of justice in matters of sin. Now, if most of us here, if all of us here were treated correctly according to the clarity of God's law and the demands of God's justice, we are all going straight to hell. You buy that? You are in Christ by God's mercy. Compassion is a cornerstone of the beauty of the gospel. But let me tell you what happens in institutional life among decision makers. Compassion becomes a harder theme to fulfill because of the obligations people in an institution have to each other, organizationally and administratively. And the scenario goes like this. Yes, Professor Ward, I know that I was to have that paper in on Monday, but my mother died, and my dog got run over by a freight train, and the house burned down, and my baby is sick. Now, especially if I know all of those matters to be true, my heart has been touched. And I am inclined to go somewhere inside me and say, yes, the rule was that you were to have the paper in on Monday, but I will accept it now or whenever you have it ready. This is the voice of compassion. But here's what happens in many an institution. And I refer here not just to educational institutions, but to human institutions in general, and especially I refer to those who are run by Christians. Well, Sally, I know all of that, but let me tell you, our faculty has been plagued with this business of late papers, and just a week ago, last Tuesday, we met once again, and the department chairman reminded us that if we make any exceptions at all, we are just opening the floodgate for all sorts of people to bring us excuses that are a lot less valid than yours. And I'm sorry, but I just can't do it, because if I did it, my colleagues would be put in a bad situation. If I did it, my colleagues would be put in a bad situation. In other words, you see, what's going on in my mind is, I would like to do it, but I'm using them and my obligations to them as my reason not to act on my compassion. Believe me, that's what happens in human institutions. The quality of mercy that is possible in individual relationships, that is characteristic in the socialization of a Christian community, often is made more difficult by the constraints of the institutional obligations that are created. Now, this is a very brief way to deal with something that should be a very long lecture on institutional ethics. But what I'm coming to is that the institutional value system is never as fine as the value system of the individuals that make it up. And the more formally structured that institution is, the harder it is for a well-developed sense of Christian compassion and Christian nurture to operate clearly. It is something about the nature of fallen man and the institutions that fallen man creates that makes the corporate entity always operate at a level of morality somewhat less elegant than the level of morality of the people that make it up. So it is not fair to say that an institution is simply an extension of the people that make it up. It is an extension of the people who make it up, depressed downward in a less godly scale. Now, that's where I start when I do any kind of analysis of formal institutions. Now, formal institutions in society are absolutely necessary. No organized society can exist without a formal structure dealing with matters of law and order. It is a fallen world. You cannot simply have a society of such goodwill that there are no policemen. It won't work. Even the Puritans found that. It won't work. Even the Quakers have found that. It won't work. Even among people who are allegedly godly. It is necessary for societies to have organizations highly institutionalized as they become more complex. For example, there's no society that can exist today without an elaborate, formalized, and highly structured banking system. It won't work. As societies become more complex, institutions become more necessary. As institutions become more necessary, the relationships among people become more formalized and more distant. You can be part of a very, very exciting little group of 12 people called, for example, we could give them the name the Disciples of Christ. And once that gets to 2,000, it's a different set of relationships. And pretty soon, in this little organization we call the Disciples of Christ, we begin seeing the effects of prejudice and neglect. Or were you not here yesterday? That was the church in Jerusalem, the Disciples of Christ, having become several thousand. And institutions are necessary in order to put in place safeguards against the drift tendencies, even within the church. What kind of institution and what kind of formalization you give it is extremely crucial. Now I'm going from that 5-cent lecture on institutional corporate ethics over into another 5-cent lecture on institutional structures, but I'm going to ask you to bear with me because I have a method in my madness. I want you to deal with YWAM ultimately, with some of these little tidbits of thought, and ask yourself, where are we going and how do we protect ourselves from the drift hazards? There are some very distinct warnings that we can make about the institutionalization that societies make called formal education. Formal education, for many of us as children, especially higher education, is a kind of a desirable goal. Once we achieve something within it, we feel very good about it, and we have our college degrees or our university diplomas, and we have this and we have that to show for it, and we feel that that was an important part in our life, and we don't want to hear anybody say anything but good things about it. And I'm sorry to disappoint you, but as a matter of fact, I've got to say some less than good things about it. Because as I see it, there is in the formal education enterprise some elements that we should be very careful not to bring in too willingly to a ministry in the name of Jesus Christ. For one thing, schools, formal education in general, are organized to deal with intellectual matters, matters of understanding, matters of information, matters of knowledge in the more rudimentary sense of knowledge. The Scripture always makes a sharp distinction between knowledge in the sense of information and wisdom in the sense of that which has been processed up to a point of being able to use it to discern. That evaluative function of knowing, which is indeed on the Bloom taxonomy, the sixth level. And much of the Scripture's references to wisdom refer to that evaluative use of knowledge at Bloom's sixth level. Schools tend to place rational ends substantially above spiritual ends. I'll repeat that. Schools tend to place rational ends substantially above spiritual ends. Even institutions called Christian colleges and Christian universities. Now, it is altogether possible for you to conceptualize a university that is radically different, that is like no other. I am simply here telling you that a giraffe has a long neck. Now, you may argue that it is possible to have a giraffe with a short neck, and all you have to do is carefully select and do a little bit of careful breeding and a little bit of neck compression exercise periodically, and you could create a giraffe with a short neck. I am simply standing here saying that as I look at giraffes, one of the things that stands out is that they have long necks. I'm not telling you what you will or won't do, what you can or can't do. I'm simply saying, from this person's objective viewpoint, schools tend to emphasize intellectual categories. And I thought YWAM was about spiritual categories. So when someone says to me that YWAM is going the direction of becoming a university, in my simple mind, it's a little bit like saying the zebra has decided to become a giraffe. And at that point, I say that's going to be really different. I hope they like it up there. Now again, I am simply raising a question based on what generally happens in and around educational institutions in our time. In our time. I've already acknowledged that the roots of the university idea were eminently Christian. But I'm raising a question in this era and the expectations of people today. What does university say? University says formal education. University says high-level formal education. University says formal institution. Now, you can disclaim any of those criteria that you want to disclaim and perhaps demonstrate that in your situation that is not true. But again, I raise the question, if you want a zebra, why not just have a zebra? Why breed one out of some poor, tired, misfit giraffes? I think you have some ways to guard against this particular problem in formal higher education. And I think the roots of guarding against it are already within you. For example, there is within the educational viewpoint of YWAM a tremendous emphasis on field work. Great, hang on to it. One of the problems within the formal education enterprise is the tendency to make the presumption that what happens in what's called an academic box, otherwise known as a classroom, is what really is important in the educative process. You see, it comes out of an epistemology. Epistemology, that's a big word that the Greeks created so that other people wouldn't understand them. Epistemology is the basis of knowing what knowledge is. How do we know what is knowledge? The epistemology of the academic box presumes that what is important in learning and knowledge is that which can be informationally communicated and grasped within that box. But as I read the word knowledge in Scripture, I see a very different epistemology. Old Testament and New, the Christian orientation toward knowledge is taught early in the Scripture and persisted into the New Testament as a matter of living on or living out, acting upon, doing, and hence the word obedience. Our generation doesn't like the word obedience, right? Sounds like authoritarianism. We don't like to talk obedience. The Scripture keeps embarrassing us because it keeps coming back to obedience. The reason the Scripture emphasizes obedience is not out of an authoritarianism, but it's out of an epistemology. It is a way of defining knowledge. It isn't knowledge until you're acting on it. How many of you have said, oh yeah, I know, but? Does that sound familiar? That's a good English American, maybe the British use it too, however I doubt it. I know better, but. In other words, my head is filled with the right stuff, but I'm not acting on it, and I don't want to. You see, in the Hebraic Christian view, that isn't even knowledge. That is simply unassimilated information. When the school is trusted to do the education, you can see through the testing that the school does that it is too difficult to test beyond the epistemology of static knowledge. What is it that is tested in schools? Information. Information, organized this way or that way, but it's basically information. You say, how in the world would we do anything else? Is it possible for us to go and watch people in life and see if they really apply this knowledge? The answer, of course, is no, you can't do that. Not within the educational institution. That is just not within the feasibilities of a school. I believe that within YWAM, because of your emphasis on field work, because of your emphasis on spiritual life motives, because of the dominance of a Christian epistemology, which I really do believe is a characteristic of this organization, because of your emphasis on maintaining within your educative environments, maintaining a spiritual growth environment first and foremost, that you have a real contrast, a substantially different kind of educational context than does the typical formal education environment. I worry a little bit lest you lose some of that in the process of becoming more formalized. Now, I have never spent any time at all on the campus in Kona. Not at all. I'm an old Hawaii hand myself. I'm a fellow of the East-West Center in Honolulu, and I have spent many, many summers doing studies in the East-West Center on the matter of culture learning. but I do not have the Kona experience. To me, Kona is a great big pile of cinders paved over with money. I just wanted you to know that I'm living dangerously. The courage of the outside consultant is usually an index of his having a return ticket. I don't have the Kona experience, and therefore I do not even imply any particular comments or judgments about the Kona campus, so don't try to read that into it. I'm looking at YWAM at large, and I'm asking the question, is YWAM at large able to sustain the kind of educational environments that you have operated so far, with their emphasis on field experience and with their emphasis on the practical and with their emphasis on the spiritual as a matter of priority even over the intellectual? Can you sustain that in the long haul if you create the expectation among people that you're becoming more like the formal education institution where none of those things is true? Schools, second point, schools in general tend to slow the process of maturity, not increase it. This flies against the common wisdom. The common wisdom is that sending your kid to college is a good way to get him to grow up. And as a matter of fact, it's not. In virtually any culture, the people who are in the marketplace, the people who are from an early age interacting in the society at large, are apt to mature more rapidly because they're engaging in a more rich variety of contexts with people. Much of the social maturity and a good bit of the intellectual maturity that the human being goes through depends on a variety of interactions, not just the same kinds of interactions repeated frequently. And it is in the general marketplace where one gets that variety. As the Apostle Paul tried to understand Athens, where did he go? He went first to the synagogue, as he always did, with the exception of one location where he got stoned. He generally went to the synagogue first and built his bridges with the community of people who had something in common with him. But then in Athens, he is described specifically as going to the marketplace day in and day out, just literally constantly. He was in that rich, textured environment where he would interact with a lot of the things going on within the city. He did not selectively go and sit in the city park one day and go over here and visit the Department of Commerce the next day. He went to the marketplace and stayed there. He got a rich interaction. Sometimes what happens to people in colleges is that they are drawn out of the marketplace and brought into a kind of an intellectual hothouse for 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years called university or called higher education. And they often end up somewhat less well off in their psychosocial adjustment than are people who have been doing the ordinary things of the socialization in those same years. I'll tell you one of the places where we're seeing this now very, very vividly around the world in reference to the church is in the matter of theological education and the preparation of pastors. Now that the modern societies, especially the technological societies, are engaged in processes that produce a veritable fervent, violent kind of change and development, if you retard the development of a 25, 26-year-old even by 2 or 3 years, that person looks strange. And there are theological seminaries in the Western world and some in the overseas world now in the service of Christ, having the effect of pulling young people out of the marketplace and out of the interaction with the general society for such a long period of time that once they fit back in again, now as allegedly ready to minister as pastors, they are out of tune with the people they're trying to minister to. And it's not that they're educated too far up, that's the common image. But as a matter of fact, they are suppressed too far down. They do not know how to interact effectively. They may be full of information, but they don't know how to interact. They don't know how to communicate because they've been out of touch. We should be very cautious about creating educational boxes within YWAM. Because once you get to be a marketer of educational boxes, you tend to suppress the development of the people you're trying to relate to. In other words, while you're trying to feed them a knowledge base, you also are pulling them away from ministry and service and experience if you don't watch out. You see, we don't do that in YOM because we don't believe in the classroom that much. Great, hang on to it. Don't invest your faith in classrooms. Classrooms are marvelous supplements to pull people together, to talk together in a relatively decent auditory environment as they process what's going on in life and get ready to go back out in life. And I'm not talking about 6 months from now, I'm talking about tomorrow. I believe in short, tight cycles of in the field into interaction and debriefing, in the field into interaction and debriefing, and I think that's what the Lord Jesus Christ used himself. I don't find him renting classroom buildings. The only facility that they're ever caught renting was an upper room to have a dinner. And that, a ceremony, not a routine of daily life. He didn't rent classroom space. But he did sit in the countryside and in the marketplace with circles of people. But almost always those interactions were with other people around in the parts of their life that the Christian is intending to interact with and to touch. We need to resist the temptation of becoming school in such a way that we retard the maturity of the people we're trying to help. Even in such matters as how we arrange housing and food services and so forth, we should be very careful not to standardize things so much that people can totally predict them. I've noticed a number of times when I've been with YOM people that various ones have said, but that's the YOM way. But that's the YOM way. You have to understand YOM. And I hear all that and I say, well, you know, that's nice, that's amusing, but it's dangerous. It's dangerous. Because when we standardize too much, when we organize in such a way that it's totally predictable, simply moving people from base to base is not going to be that rich an environment because it doesn't demand enough in the way of adjustment and change. You want to be very careful about creating the standard stuff of education. High predictability. You want to be very careful also how you involve students in decision making. If you do the decision making for people, they'll learn to like it. They'll learn to like it. I don't have to worry. They make the decisions and it always turns out pretty good. Now that's, on one level, that's kind of nice. That tells you that there's a real high level of institutional trust. But in terms of development of people and the competency of people to stand alone in their own contexts of life, I really worry about that. But schools in general and educational strategies modeled on schools tend to be that way. One of the things you've got going for you, you ought to very carefully preserve it and expand it, is the intercultural team experience. Intercultural, multilingual team experience will be a victim if you formalize your education very much. It will be a victim. We saw that yesterday when in the process of doing discussion, a linguistic group wanted to isolate itself in this room. Now, I've been in linguistic situations that were so fatiguing. After hours and hours, I was just deliciously anticipating being able to talk with some people that will use my language. I've been there. I know the feeling. I'm not condemning it. I'm not even criticizing it. I'm just warning that if you put up the pressure on the formalization of education, you will tend to fragment, not accrete. You will tend to pull people apart into linguistic similarities, into cultural background similarities, into likeness, not into unlikeness. You take a look at this in any university. Every university that I've ever seen has little sets of people working together according to their national backgrounds. And it's natural. And as the pressure goes up academically, those groups become tighter and more isolated. I don't think that's what you want. I think we need to help all participants within the YWAM operation, help all participants come to understand their own development as a process, not something that is being given to them, but as something that they are participating in, because God has created us developing creatures. Third problem, educational purposes within schools tend toward academic ends. You say, well, of course. It's a little like saying that fire departments tend to spend much of their time putting out fires. What else are they there for? That's the problem. What else are they there for? I submit to you that one of the great strengths of YWAM is that your educating is not done for primarily academic ends. You follow me? Keep it that way. Keep those ends in focus and make sure that the institutional forms you create do not rearrange those outcomes. You need to develop a judgment on all your educational activity in terms of not of its academic value, but in terms of its functional value in mission. Now, does that necessarily conflict? Not necessarily, but sometimes it does. Sometimes it does. The problem with academic ends is that they tend to be too short-sighted. In general, educational institutions are in no position to take responsibility for what happens to their students after they get into life. And one of the most serious shortfalls of formal education is its Pontius Pilate shrugging and washing the hands and saying, beyond here we can do nothing. Take it away. We've done our piece. And I can't see anyone, whether a parent or a minister or a person in ministry with young people and the development of God's people as leaders and as spiritually developing creatures, I can't see any of us rightly washing our hands of anyone saying, well, I've done the best I can. Someone else will have to take it from here. It's too tempting to do that if you operate within a formal education enterprise. One of the real problems for any teacher in a school, and I feel this one deeply, is that you're cycling through so many people. You're cycling through so many people. Even those you build a close affiliation with, in a matter of a year or two or three, they've begun to become very dim and blurred in your mind. You're dealing with too many people. It's like being in a factory and trying to take any sense of pride in your product. You rarely can go out into the streets and say, there's one that I helped put together. Except in general, there's an Oldsmobile. Yeah, I work at Oldsmobile. And sometimes school people have a lot of frustration because many people go into formal education because of a deep desire to have the affiliation over a long period of time with people and help them in their development. Discipleship. And within the formal enterprise, that's very difficult. Most of us within the walk of life develop relationships and affiliations, and sometimes we do that outside our schooling responsibilities. But it's awfully hard to do it with inside. I'm in a rather privileged position because as a person who for about 24 years now has worked almost exclusively with PhD students and EDD students, I work with relatively small numbers. And I enjoy something that very few of my professional education colleagues can enjoy. I know where almost 4/5 of my previous students are today. But that's because I'm dealing with relatively small numbers. But I value that because I have invested myself in their lives. At home, though when I'm overseas the long-distance calls make it very difficult, when I'm at home there's hardly a day that goes by that I'm not on the telephone for a little piece of time with a former student. That's a wonderful way to live. But it is not typical of the relationships of people within the formal education enterprise. And I'm not simply talking about the people in the non-Christian institutions. I'm talking about in the Christian institutions. Because I'm not all that convinced that the Christian institutions take their work very seriously. I really am not. For example, many a small Christian higher education institution takes such pride in being small and Christian that their message to their students, in effect, is, you are really blessed because you're here, and we're all Christians, and we all love each other, and we're going to just make a very happy, congenial Christian family together. And after they say that, there's nothing else done about it. Because those things you can't just say, you have to work at them day after day after day. And if you take for granted that smallness will produce that, you'll miss it. As a graduate of one of the Christian colleges that makes that kind of a claim, I was rather surprised when I went to graduate school a few years later at a major university. And I was dead sure, because of my experience at this Christian college, they had warned me that I should be very sure that I would find this an overwhelming experience, and that people would be attacking my faith and probably not even interested in me as a person. I could tell you some interesting stories about the encounters with people at that institution. But let me just start with one. When I arrived at that institution, the first person I met was the secretary at the admissions office, who said, Mr. Ward, you haven't sent in an application. And I said, well, I know, but I didn't realize that I was going to need to go to graduate school right now. She says, but you know it takes us about 6 weeks to 2 months to process an application. And this is the last day of registration. I mean, talk about silly, naive, uninformed, needy. Because God had just moved us, an experience in life that I shared with you the other day, and had changed our direction. We were really lost, as it seemed. I was the first person I met at a secular institution. A person telling me in the best language of formal higher education, you can't do it. Because it has to be done this way. The second person I met, in fact, I met at that moment in the conversation, was a little man about so high who popped out of a side office about then and said, did I hear someone say Wheaton College? And I said, it was me. He says, I don't know anything about Wheaton College. Tell me about Wheaton College. I said, well, you know, it's a Christian college near Chicago. Oh, yes, I know that much. What about it? And I said, well, that's where I went. He says, are you a Christian? And I said, yes, sir. He says, so am I. And he says, my name's Charlie Durrance. I'm the director of admissions here. What can I do for you? And I said, well, Dr. Durrance, I seem to be in a tough situation. He says, most of the people I deal with are. I said, I've got a wife and a baby and a trailer outside this building. And we're currently on the move because we thought God wanted us to do one thing, and when we got there, we found out that wasn't what God wanted us to do right now. And I said, would you understand it if I said, I think God is testing us? He says, I sure would. He says, I know about that. He says, so you want to get into graduate school, eh? I said, yes, and I don't have anything with me except a rather tired, well, you can't carry a transcript like that. It's got to be an official transcript. But, he says, is it valid? I said, it's real. He says, okay. Let's see now, what else are we going to need? Well, registration closes in 2 hours and a half. Can you run? I'm not making this up. I was the second man I met in a large, disinterested, secular institution. God has his people there. And I found more warmth in that environment in the first 3 weeks than I had found in 4 weeks in that other college on the part of the faculty. Why? Because they were taking it seriously that they had to do something to relate to people, to build a relationship. You say, well, if they can do it in the secular world, we can do it in the Christian world. Watch out. We take too much for granted. And the more you move toward the formalizing, the more you will take for granted. Here's an insidious one. In general, students' purposes tend away from Christian purposes. In general, even among Christian students in Christian institutions, students' purposes or motives tend away from Christian purposes in a high percentage of the cases. Many students are using the educational environment, the institution, the process of getting their education, towards some kind of a goal that in our time is less than a well-defined spiritual goal. There are people who are interested in using the college years simply to get themselves ready vocationally, to get on with some other kind of a career that then they will show what it is to be a Christian in this world of commerce or this world of psychology or this thing. And the college experience is regarded as a kind of a grand parenthesis in which you kind of bid God farewell at one end and pick him up at the other end and say, here we go again. And this tendency to misuse life within the formal education years is something you don't want to buy into. I tell you that as a matter of directive advice. You don't want to buy into that. You have got to protect yourself against being misused by students who have irrelevant purposes. But you will find that as you get certain students on board, you will adapt yourself to them so that you can fulfill their purposes and your purposes somehow. And the whole thing begins to scramble up. You say, well, that wouldn't happen with us. You don't understand how singular-minded our YWAM students are. But let me tell you something. You ain't seen nothing yet. You start dealing with the thousands that you're talking about, and you're going to see a lot more chaff per wheat than you ever thought existed among people who want to use your educational interests and values. You should be very careful to recruit and deal primarily with those who will value spiritual outcomes. But you'll have to do more than that. You'll have to keep your mission clearly centered on spiritual outcomes and ministry consequences. And I'm having a hard time figuring how you're going to do that while you're at the same time communicating to people that we are another university. A different one, but let me tell you something. There's not a university or a college or an institution in the world that doesn't claim some kind of uniqueness. And students generally shrug and say, yeah. And then they simply pick and choose this way and that way. If you begin to join that market, you're going to find that there are expectations out there that are a lot more powerful than you've had to deal with yet. Unfortunately, and this is my fifth point, Christians, when behaving as educators, tend to be very traditional. Christians are not among the world's most innovative educators. It is very difficult to get any traditionalized person to be highly innovative. There's a sociological explanation for this. Institutions in general exist in societies to hold societies to old values. Institutions preserve. Institutions conserve and maintain. Institutions such as the church, for example, are served by the institutions of education of the church, and then you have a double dose of that conserving thing. The church is a conservative entity within society, and its institutions of education are inherently serving conservative values. People who have inherently conservative values tend not to value change, tend not to value innovation, tend not to value diversity. Watch out. I think you have to keep your educational task well integrated within the mission at large, not simply as a function of the mission, but the way you define education needs to be defined in such a way that it is constantly under an innovative development that brings more and more a closeness between the educational outcomes and the purpose and function of the mission. Especially avoid people who need to control things. Especially avoid people who need to control things. And there are a lot of high control-oriented Christians in education. Evaluate your ends very carefully. Are the outcomes that you're achieving, not the ones that you're hoping for, but the ones that you're achieving, are these really worthwhile? Evaluate your means carefully. Are these means really worthwhile and engaging? And keep questing for more effective means. Continuously make room for innovation. Draw upon the Holy Spirit for creativity and flexibility. The name of God is change and development. Yes, his word is eternal. Yes, his character is unchanging. But yes, the works of his hands and the creation which we are and in which we live is dynamic to the glory of God, changing, developing, emerging as a kind of roiling pot, boiling constantly in the move. May we be as that, responsibly attending to change and development. The sixth and last of these dangers of drift is a kind of corporate warning. Organizations which sponsor schools tend to become preoccupied with the institutional issues of the schools. Once an organization puts a lot of its emphasis within the schooling business, it tends to be narrowly focused over time. One of the things that even some of the modern industries have discovered is that it's better to contract out some of their educational tasks to other entities rather than letting the whole corporation become absorbed in its training schools. Very interesting way this works. What I'm suggesting is that since there are, in the maintenance of any educational institution, daily problems and issues that have to be confronted at high levels and low in the organization, these very quickly become the dominant preoccupiers of people's time and attention. Now, having said all this in the negative, let me tell you why I'm saying it and where I'm going with all of this. I've appreciated the fact that any number of you have complained to me, in effect, gently but surely, what in the world are you driving at? I appreciate that problem. But believe me, I am driving at something. Some parts of it are beginning to show. But in the final analysis, what I'm up against is the problem of communicating effectively such a large concept in such a small amount of time that I can't possibly do it in any one given hour. And I appreciate your steadfast patience to try to hear me out on these things. And let me again say, perhaps more directly than ever, I could be very wrong about virtually anything I'm saying. I could be very wrong. All I can tell you is that I am being faithful to what I believe God has given me in experience. The relationship of my experience and my insights to your needs and your situation may or may not be close. You will have to judge that, because I think that among Christians we are warned to hear each other in a discriminating way, making judgments and sorting out, accepting the good and throwing away that which is less good. You are free to do this without offending me, and obviously you will do this whether I invite you to or not. I just want you to know it's not going to bother me if you say, Ward, I really don't think you understand our situation. It won't be the first time that people have told me that. I would like to suggest to you that you in YWAM have been operating in the non-formal education mode. Now I'm coming down to some payoff here. Now, why didn't I say that the other day? Well, I put the model on the board in order to let you try to think through where you were at and lived with that for a while. And I know some of you have because you've come to me with your conjectures and speculations. Allow me on the board again. The triad that I put on the board yesterday, and I have again now positioned about the same way, suggests along the bottom line that there is a continuum of formal to socialized education. Socialization has nothing to do with the political posture of socialism or communism or even fried apples. It has nothing to do with any of those things. It has to do with what societies do. By the way, are you aware that you are not born with a culture? Let me illustrate this. We have 5 children, and when our 5th child was on the way, my wife and I felt very heavily the responsibility of this 5th child, and we enrolled in language school at night to study Chinese because we were very well aware that the statistics are that every 5th child born in this world speaks Chinese. You passed the test, by the way. That's my standard test to find out if people really understand that culture is learned. If I ask you how many of you were born English, born American, born Spanish, born Italian, born Swiss, and that's my other test. How many of you were born Swiss? Let me see your hands. You failed. You were born human. You were enculturated Swiss. And you say, wait a minute, I thought you were talking about citizenship and I had a passport when I arrived. Well, I happen to know that's not true either. As a matter of fact, the Swiss civil government didn't even know about you until after you arrived, long after you arrived, and then they began to acknowledge you as a Swiss. In the case of Americans, they're willing to do it earlier. Not as discriminating. Seriously, we learn culture, we learn language. We are what we have become. You could split up any 2 identical twins and raise one of them Spanish and the other Italian. They'd still look a lot alike. They'd still behave a lot alike, but they sure wouldn't sound alike. Socialization. Very powerful, very powerful. And what I have on here really is a kind of a map, a sociological map of educational purposes. Now, what is the purpose of socialization? To bring people into the rudiments of a culture. That's all it is. To bring people into the rudiments of a culture. So what is the early on task for socialization? Language. What do you spend time with your child as an infant? Language and rudimentary behavior. Very rudimentary behavior. Where do kids learn to walk on a certain side of the street? Or ride their bicycles on a certain side of the street? All this is socialization. It's part of the survival skills of functioning effectively in a society. Now, there are certain tasks that are more in the form of academic. By academic, we simply define off certain tasks and call them academic tasks. And then the socialization sector tends to not emphasize them because the formal sector will. In some societies that have very little access to formal education, if the child learns to count in order to be able to make change in the marketplace, where is that skill going to be learned? Socialization. And there are children the marketplace children of Latin America, the marketplace children of certain parts of the Orient. These children learn the marketplace skills, including arithmetic, in the socialization sector. But it's very typical for an American family to pay very little attention to anything beyond counting and asking, how many fingers? Isn't that good? Little Charlie can tell us that that's 5. Lovely, Charlie. How many is this? 2. That's great. Charlie's only 19 years old. He's doing great. And the very fact that you laugh says that you know that there are expectations of where certain things occur, when they will occur, when it's appropriate for them to be the educational task. Now, Charlie, can you explain the theory of relativity? And Charlie does a marvelous job explaining the theory of relativity. You say, Charlie, that's really great. For a kid 3 years old, that's doing great. You say, well, that's not right. That's the 19-year-old. See, you know where these things fit, because both socialization and the formal education sector are very much based in tradition. You see, both socialization and formal education share something in common. They are, by common agreement in a society, they are commonly ascribed certain kinds of roles and positions and values. They have certain tasks. And it's generally understood in any society approximately when a child will begin to deal with higher mathematics like algebra. In one society, it's when they're 9 years old. It's another society, it's when they're 12 years old. But where are those expectations created? In the traditional values of that society. And those traditional values dare not be violated. If a school starts doing this too early or too late, the whole community will speak up about it because it's violating a tradition. And one illustration of that is what happens in the United States when you begin to require foreign language of everybody. Every 13-year-old has to take foreign language in certain situations. Boy, when that is introduced, there is a tremendous amount of reaction because in the traditions of the United States, nobody has to learn to speak a second language. You always make it an option. That's our tradition. Whereas in the formal education and the socialization of other countries, where do you begin to learn your second language? In socialization, in the process of survival. Most Swiss children will begin to do some second language learning in neighborhoods when they're very, very small. In most of the so-called third world, children are trilingual by the age 10. They have a family language, which is usually a very small dialect language. They have a trade language, and quite often they're marketing themselves on the street one way or the other in a major language of French, a major trade language, international trade language of English or French. And this is taken for granted. But again, it's tradition. It's tradition. And if you pull person or educational process out of one place and put them in another, it would not fit. Tradition. Now, this analytic map allows us to see that there are several different kinds of purposes fulfilled. What did I associate with the formal education? I associated with it yesterday one symbol, and I kept referring back to that symbol. What was the symbol? This symbol of the ladder says several things about formal education that are in common around the world. Formal education always has the notion of structured sequence. Structured sequence. By the way, in the socialization sector, at what stage do we begin working on future tense? In the socialization sector, at what stage do we begin working on language future tense? You're not laughing because you're not hearing my question. That's funny. That really is funny. Who thinks of socialization, language learning, in terms of verb tenses? If I say verb tense, what am I talking about? Formal education. And in many societies, children learn rather functionally to use present, past, future, and some of the other tenses in a given language as a kind of a language flow. And we know this, that if they learn them as early patterns, they don't need to know the rationale. but they'll hear the sound of it and it'll stay with them longer. What does formal education do? Turns it around and teaches the rationale and the labeling system, and it doesn't stick at all. Formal education tends to use, in many fields, very, very contrasting methodologies to socialization, and thus produce very short-term effects. Socialization tends to produce long-term effects. I already mentioned to you that Deuteronomy 6, having to do with how parents should train their children, is clearly a pattern for socialization. It is not a pattern for schools. It would be inappropriate for schools, because it talks about doing things on the doorposts and doing things in the street and when you walk. My goodness, it doesn't sound like an academic box at all, does it? It's life. Now, the ladder expresses that structured sequence so that we can ask questions like, should we introduce the future tense before the past tense? And it asks us questions like, should we teach algebra before we teach geometry? And by the way, if you want to get people really excited internationally on curriculum matters, ask them that one. Boy, I mean, they can really get the teeth in that one. Oh boy. Is it appropriate to teach philosophy in the secondary school? Boy, you can have fun with that one too. Wow, we argue about funny little abstract things. But we have to do this because traditionally the ladder must be named and the rungs must be structured. There's another way that the rung system, the walking step-by-step of a ladder, exemplifies formal education. If I ask a small child, why is it that you are in this particular level of this particular school? What will he answer? Generally, worldwide, he will answer in some kind of a way. If he doesn't simply shrug and say, you're crazy, he will say, how else would I get to the next level? Because the value of every level in formal education is defined in terms of its enabling you to move to the next level. Hence, the rungs of a ladder. If I asked you which rung of the ladder is most important, you would know that to be something of a silly question. Now, I want to go to the very top of this ladder because I must paint a window that is very high. Which rungs of the ladder can I omit? I will take my saw and remove some of these rungs on the ladder because all I need is the top rung in order to paint my window. Do I have a basic problem in understanding the ladder at that point? Yes, it's a rather stupid view of the ladder. Every one of those rungs is necessary to get me to that rung that I want to stand on. And that's exactly what formal education does. It creates the rungs in a traditionalized, highly organized, regimented sequence so that each rung is justified by the one that follows it. I don't know how it is in every country, but I have worked in enough countries to know that this phrase is standard among many teachers. The child says, why do we need to learn that? Usually it has a little more elaborate answer. Someday you will need that. Someday you will understand that. Someday. And children grow up in formal education believing that the importance of formal education is someday. Now, I submit to you what I read in James is not concerned with someday. Even in higher education, there is that someday mentality shot through much of formal education. That's not true in socialization. But it is true over here. Because socialization, or the society, generally pushes that someday notion clear over here and gives it to the formal enterprise, and they create a ladder out of it. Now, that little analytic tool, the bottom line, was the one that was around for a long, long time. Used that since early in the 1800s. The term non-formal education, or NFE, or any of the other derivative terms, like, for example, development education, is a fairly modern, very recent term, but not a new idea, just a new label. Combs' point was that because we don't have a good label for it, we tend not to focus it very clearly in mind. But there is a lot of education that is neither formal education nor socialization. It borrows some of its methodologies from socialization, some of its methodologies from formal education, but it serves a different kind of a purpose. It serves a highly functional purpose. In the same sense that socialization is functional, so is non-formal education. Parents of 4-year-olds do not teach them irrelevant languages. Parents of 4-year-olds do not teach them irrelevant languages. Parents of 3-year-olds do not teach their children mathematics, because there is no functional value for a 3-year-old of a language. We begin in the socialization sector to teach things that relate to survival and effective living as they emerge in the consciousness and the awareness of the child, and as they emerge in the realities of that society. Similarly, in non-formal education, we do things that are focused on a functional reality at the point in which they are significant. A person needs to know how to plant a particular kind of a crop. It's at that point that the person seeks out the agricultural education agent and says, "Help me, I need to know." This is non-formal education. Non-formal education shares then with socialization a functionality that is not characteristically true of formal education. In fact, you can begin to see that each of these pairs shares something with its adjacent neighbor, but it's a very different thing that it shares. Now, what is it that non-formal education shares with formal education? It shares structure. Not the same structure, but it has a structure. If I asked you, is socialization a structured educational operation, you would say, of course not. Very non-structured. But non-formal does not mean non-structured. Non-formal education, just as surely as formal education, is planned, staffed, resourced, and is deliberate. Now, it's not that socialization is not deliberate so much as that it plays out its deliberateness in kind of naturalistic ways. And no one ever stops and says in the family, "Oh, dear Charles, what must we do about little Willie? We must somehow teach him to speak the language. Perhaps we should start tomorrow." Parents don't do that. Parents don't have those planning meetings with each other to decide whether or not to teach the child to speak the language. They do this naturally. Yeah, it's deliberate, but it certainly isn't planned and structured. Non-formal education is not the same thing as unplanned education. It is absolutely as concerned with planning, but the difference is that it does not define itself in terms of a fixed position ladder. It defines itself functionally in terms of relating to ad hoc situational needs for learning as they emerge and as they occur. Now, you can do an interesting thing with this diagram, and it's kind of fun to play with in your mind. Those of you who are conceptualizers, you'll enjoy this. The rest of you will wonder why we bothered. It is possible. How do you spell deliberate, Ted? I don't know. That's the missing T. This is for the benefit of the television camera that we'll always have to explain to future generations what this is all about. By the way, none of this tape is going to heaven. I'm beginning to wonder if I will. Across from each of these commons is the antithesis of that common. Very fascinating. What is the antithesis of tradition? What is the antithesis of structured and deliberate? What is the antithesis of traditional? And by the way, this is not just a happenstance of the diagram. There's a great deal of research that was done in the 70s that established this is really the way non-formal education exists and works in societies. It generally is the tool that works in a contra-traditional way. Did that need to be done? Because of the lights. Would you say that in general, YWAM is more concerned with traditional values or non-traditional values? That's a hard one to answer because we have to define our terms. Let me try to help you a little bit on that. The traditions of this world are the dominant traditions in the lives of people of our time. Would you say that's true? I think so. And in that sense, at least, think with me, is YWAM in the business of passing on those traditions? Aren't you, in fact, countercultural? Then what in the world do you have to do with a tradition-bound communicating device? Are you not looking for something that does exactly what you've been doing, which is to work in a constructive, countercultural way, to work for a different set of values known as kingdom values? And I would warn you, are you sure you want to trade in your non-formal education habit for a formal education habit? I think not. I doubt seriously. But then I'm meddling. So that we not fail to notice on this chart, though it's not directly pertinent to us, what is the antithesis of functionality? Okay, at this point we begin to get a little bit on the heavy-handed side, right? If we haven't been already. There's a lot of interesting truth there, although the exaggerating of it is certainly not fair. For many of us, formal education has been a very important part of our development of gifts and competencies and abilities, and put us in positions of relationship and network that allow us to deal effectively with things we might not otherwise be able to deal with. And I, for one, would be very hypocritical to suggest to you that formal education has no value, or is, yes, valuable for me but not for you, or any of the rest of that rather elitist sort of thinking. Formal education, however, should be understood to be primarily traditional and primarily not assessing itself in functional terms. It is not typical in formal education to make functional assessment. Again, I've said this about a dozen different ways, but it boils down to the question of how much you take responsibility for what happens when a person tries to use the things you've taught. Now, the third of these contrasting axes is, of course, from structured and deliberate over to socialization. And this is worth looking at because there's an important point to be made. Clearly, the structured and deliberate qualities of non-formal and formal education do stand in contrast with socialization. But socialization is what we are really concerned about, ideally and centrally within the community of Christ. Is it not true that we are developing Christian families? That's why I spend time writing books like Values Begin at Home. I think that is a central focus of our concern. The development of Christian families, Christian communities, the nature of the church, the nature of the fellowship and body of Christ. This is absolutely our concern, and in the Deuteronomy 6 sense, it is a responsibility that we consider the quality of that socialization process. Now, here's the problem. You can't deal directly with socialization. The minute you start doing something deliberate to it, it changes it. But what we have found is that whereas the formal education enterprise has relatively little effect on the socialization sector, in fact, it tends to be a reflection of the socialization sector, It tends not to lead it, but to follow it. And by the way, my problem with some people who are, as in the Bloom view, criticizing higher education and education in general for having done this or that to the American society. There's a book by Alan Bloom that has been common in the last year. His presumption, I think, is basically fallacious. His stuff is great if you can buy his principal assumption. His principal assumption is that the schools lead society. I don't think so. I think the schools reflect society. I think the schools are exactly what the people want them to be. And they aren't leading society, they are reflecting society, they're following society. And Christians have always argued that if you could put Christian schools in place, you could lead society, and it hasn't worked. I believe that what you're going to have to do is what the sociologists of education found in the 70s is happening, and that is that if you want to affect socialization, you can do it much more directly through non-formal education. The impact of non-formal on socialization is greater. So therefore today, in the area of development education, where we're trying to work in terms of the development of new society structures, in post-colonial nations, for example, where most of my career has been focused, we never do anything anymore in the formal education enterprise and expect it to stick. We do it almost all in the non-formal. We do it all through seminars, workshops, field experiences, and we do the kind of training that YWAM has been doing. And ironically, even our major universities use that approach and quite typically use a non-degreed approach to it. We did work at Michigan State for years when I was there in the area of non-formal education development for foreign nationals, and we brought them over by the truckloads in the summer for the summer institutes, and we never gave any degrees in it. It was outside our degree structure. It was in the sector of the university that we'd created as a non-formal education institute. And our university was flexible enough that it could do that. Let me close. I'm trying this morning to suggest to you that there are some things to think about. There are some things to know. There are some things to labor over with reference to the imagery and the goals and the aspirations that you have for the University of the Nations. You may wonder at this point whether I am really saying X or Y. Am I saying the University of the Nations is a good idea or a bad idea? If you really brought it down to the question of is it a good idea or a bad idea, I would say yes, it is. It is a good idea and it is a bad idea. It is a good idea up to certain points and it's a bad idea at other points. And I think by now you can begin to see where I draw that line. And I believe that what you have done within Youth with a Mission is largely already focused as educational enterprise and activity. Even what many of you call evangelization has a focal meaning, has a primary meaning as bringing people into an understanding of the claims of Christ so that they might learn of our Lord. There's an educational meaning in that. But so help me, with the possible exception of some of your certification programs in possibly primary education, preschool education, and possibly in counseling. For the most part, what you've been doing, I would classify straight away as non-formal education. There is a legitimacy in non-formal education. Now the problem comes in two particulars when you switch to the University of the Nations. Do you hear where those are? Number one, the linguistics of it alone. The name university sounds like formal. And in the minds of most hearers, that is what they will make of it, and they will bring their whole bag of expectations and dump it right on you and say, conform to it. And you will say, we have no intention of being what the universities are in our time in general. We're going to hark back to an earlier model. And then people are going to say, huh? And stuff like that. The other problem is that in your own minds and reasoning, the idea of university could pull you away from the functionalism that you have enjoyed so far into the contrast of functionalism in reference to the structures, the rigidity, the framework the beholdenness to certain kinds of rigor that are characteristic of formal education. What would I recommend to you? You can easily hear several possibilities. Lauren yesterday ruled out one of the possibilities. Drop the name. Quite frankly, my first reaction was exactly that. I believe, however, that there are several other possible reactions. One, accept the name and make it a matter of pioneering evangelistic thrust to show this world what a university could be for Christ. And I think that's Lauren's vision. And that is not silly. It is dangerous. But not silly. And I'm not joking. When I say it's dangerous, I think you know now where I'm talking about some of the dangers. Okay? I'm not going to rehearse them right now in summary. And then there's a third possibility. And I have discussed this with Lauren, and he has given me freedom to say this too. I haven't checked everything with Lauren by any means. Don't hold him culpable and responsible for my stuff. But I have a respect for him, and I have a respect for this organization. And I don't see that it's a responsible business of any Christian to go around and tell other Christians where they're right or where they're wrong. That's not my place. I respect you, and I respect your work. I respect Laura, and I respect the others that are leaders in this organization. And before I'm even going to make a suggestion to you about something to think about, I want to make sure that that kind of reasoning and thinking is acceptable and is going to be regarded as constructive within his organization. And Lauren says, please do it. I threw it out as a kind of a sideways trial balloon the other day. But let me come back to you in a little more seriousness to end this session. One of the problems that I think you're going to have is that people have such strong expectations of what a university means. And you're not going to have the time, the space, and the ear of everyone to explain what it is that you're meaning by the idea of University of the Nation. So you probably need a very strong, clear subtitle. I don't know exactly how best to do it, and it may be that because of language differences, we need several different variations on the subtitle in the various languages, because in various language centers, we have different kinds of things we want to try to say. But I think 2 or 3 ideas could be put in that terse subtitle. 5, 6 words, not a long explanation, but I would like to see the word network. The word network. Because I think you're going to find a tremendous power and value coming from a network of cells rather than a totally unified single organism. Networks are very acceptable today now that computers have made networks of knowledge possible. People talk about networks in a very positive way in most of the technological world and even much of the developing world. Why not something like a network of? Then, of course, we're going to have the word educational in here somewhere, or education, because that's what it is. We might want to have the word Christian ministry, or for Christian learning, or for Christian education, or some of those words in there. But would it clear it up if we used something that also had the idea of non-formal in it? If we had a subtitle like, for example, a network for non-formal learning in Christian ministry, I think you might be able to find resolutions for quite a number of the issues that some of us are really concerned about. Think about it. Thanks, Lauren.